Hey guys, Mr. Happy here and welcome to Final Fantasy Bestiary, where we go over the history and lore of some of Final Fantasy's most popular creatures and characters. In this episode, we'll be looking over the cute but ever so deadly Tonberry. Now, the Tonberry is a recurring creature in the Final Fantasy series. It is one of the most popular and one of the most deadly as well. It's sometimes featured as a summon or a party member through monster taming and different means, but it's generally accepted to be an enemy that you want to avoid for the most part. The Tonberries all have similar characteristics with some variation. They're usually very short, less than 3 feet tall. They usually have green skin and yellow eyes, and I only know that because they told me. They usually have round, smooth heads with dark brown cloaks. They usually carry a butcher knife and a lantern as their signature, well, main hand and offhand, I guess you could say. Now, there are occasionally larger or different colored Tonberries that appear in games. I couldn't tell you all of them because I can't see the colors for the most part. However, this design is likely an ode to the sea monks of Western and Japanese folklore, who were fish-like men with shaved heads and monk robes, although the knife seems to be more of a characteristic towards psychopaths and American horror films. Now, the Tonberry's behavior is a little bit sketchy. They're usually aggressive towards any other race other than their own. They're mostly slow-moving, and they walk up to opponents very slowly before unleashing devastating attacks. They usually attack alone, although they have been seen to appear in groups, and they seem to very much dislike being attacked themselves. Now, speaking of their attacks, they have a few attacks that are generally standard across most of them, although the name variations and actual damage calculations seem to vary from game to game. Usually they have an attack called Knife or Chef's Knife, which usually either instantly KOs or deals a massive amount of damage to their targets. They also have an attack called Karma, which is usually used as a magical counterattack, and they also use an attack that in variation of names is called Everyone's Grudge, which is an attack that usually increases in damage when enemies are slain. Keep in mind that the enemy is required to be slain in order to increase the damage varies from game to game as well. On top of that, they usually have high HP and generally high damage output, so they're generally considered a monster that you, well, want to avoid. But now that we know some things about the Tonberry, how about we dive into their history when they first started in Final Fantasy V? That's right, it took all the way until Final Fantasy V for these little green guys to get into the game, and when they made their premiere appearance here, they weren't even called their real names. In fact, they were called the Tonberry with a slight variation on the spelling. However, in the translation for Anthology, they were actually called Dingleberries, and finally became Tonberries in the Game Boy Advance version of Final Fantasy V. Their only real traits here was that they walked very slowly towards the party and used an attack called Cleaver, which is essentially this game's chef knife, which did a lot of damage and ignored defense. Now, there isn't much to say about Final Fantasy V, so let's go on to Final Fantasy VI, where their names would be done wrong again, I guess you could say. I guess they were still exploring the naming portion of the Tonberries at this point. In the SNES version, which was also called Final Fantasy III, we're not going to get into that right now, they were called Pugs, and they were also called this in the Anthology version. It took until the Game Boy Advance version for them to finally be called Tonberries. Interestingly enough, though, the Bestiary in the Anthology on PlayStation 1 did call them Tonberries, but in the game they were still called Pug. Now, they also use the knife attack in this game, although it's primarily used as a counter. However, the more interesting attack that they have is called Lore Traveler. This is the only game that I'm aware that they have this move, and this move deals more damage for each step that the party took. So in Final Fantasy VI, the amount of steps that you took in the game was counted, and the Tonberry did damage based on that number. The Master Tonberry also appears as a monster in the box in the game and has a different color than the normal Tonberries. Now, Final Fantasy VII, they appeared exclusively in the Golden Saucer Battle Square, which for those of you who never played 7 was essentially a place where you did battle with monsters under various effects. They were meant to appear in Whirlwind Maze, but they never did, even though the files in the game suggest that the encounters had already been planned. Now, in this game, they walk slowly towards the party and will instantly kill a member with their knife attack. There's also a Master Tonberry in the Northern Cave that uses Everyone's Grudge, however, which deals increased damage depending on how many enemies the players have slain in the entire game. They also appear in Final Fantasy VII off-series, such as Before Crisis and Crisis Core. And Before Crisis, they just make a very simple appearance. However, in Crisis Core, they are only enemies in very special missions, and can even be obtained as a summon through obtaining the Tonberry knife item. Now, moving on to Final Fantasy VIII, They actually had quite an impressive appearance in this game. They appeared primarily in the Central Ruins, and they also appeared in the final dungeon, Ultimecia's Castle. They used Chef's Knife and Karma in this game very similarly, and they did walk up very slowly to the party before doing Chef's Knife. However, if a certain number of them were defeated in the Central Ruins, a Tonberry King would spawn, and this number changed slightly depending on the save file, but it was usually somewhere between 18 and 22, with slight variation in rare case occurrences. He had a crown and a few unique attacks that aren't really seen in any of the other games. He has an attack called It's Sharp, which is very similar to Chef's Knife, although it simply just deals a lot of damage and doesn't instantly KO. Junk, which is a basic attack that that drops junk on the entire enemy party. It does a lot of damage, though. And finally, a basic physical attack without any sort of name. If you defeat him, you actually gain a Tonberry as a Guardian Force, which is this game's summons, and it's actually quite useful and powerful. Next, we have Final Fantasy IX, where they appeared in Ibsen's castle and instantly kill anyone they hit with Chef's Knife attack. They also have Everyone's Grudge. However, in this game, its damage is calculated based on the number of Tonberries killed, so it only begins really hurting your party if you're in this area for too long. Moving on to Final Fantasy X, they appeared in two places. They appeared in the Cavern of Stolen Faith, and a Master Tonberry would appear in the Omega Ruins. However, there was also the Dawn Tonberry, who appears in the Monster Arena boss as a secret boss after the end of the game. He uses three moves, two of which you've heard before and one that was unique to this game. The first one is Chef's Knife, the second one is Karma. They're both used in similar manners, with Karma being a counterattack and Chef's Knife being their very basic attack once they're in range of the party. However, they also have the move Voodoo, which will instantly kill any summoned Aeon, which is this game's summons. In 10-2, they do make another appearance in the Via Infinito, an optional dungeon in the game, and they also appear as Mega Tonberries, which can be extremely difficult enemies. It was highly recommended that these were avoided unless you were looking for certain blue bullet skills or anything along those lines. Now, in Final Fantasy XI, the Tonberries didn't have a major role, but they did have a good backstory. They were a race of beastmen that were primarily appearing around Ugalepi Temple in the Yotar jungle and Soja in the northern parts of the continent. As a race, the Tonberry hated all other forms of life due to their god Ugalepi being cursed by Altana to become hideous and exiled. For those of you who don't know, Altana is the god of the 5 enlightened races, which in Final Fantasy XI were Golkas, Tarutarus, Elvons, Humes, and Mithras. So they are also remains of the Kulu, which were an ancient race of people exiled from the Zylardian capital of Altair, due to their lack of ability to communicate telepathically. Once they were sent to Vana'diel, they were warped by an event called the Meltdown 1,000 years prior to Final Fantasy XI's taking place, which is what caused them to become incredibly morphed into the form of the Tonberries. Now, they have an attack, they have their usual attacks, they auto-attack, and they do have some very unique attacks, Light's Penance reducing the TP of some of them. However, their primary attack was called Everyone's Grudge. And now this did increase damage with every Tonberry slain. The exact calculation was it did 5 damage to a player for every Tonberry that player had slain in the game. This means that after a certain point, killing too many Tonberries will get you immediately killed if this attack hits you. There was even a version called Everyone's Rancor, which was used by some of the Tonberry NMs, and this would do 50 damage per Tonberry slain, so this move was even more likely to kill you if you had any sort of Tonberry slain in the history. You were able to wipe this sort of slate where you killed Tonberries clean, however, it was generally accepted that you should avoid Tonberries so that you don't accrue more damage taken from these attacks. They can also very rarely be spoken to in their original Kulu spirit forms, this making it the second game where the player could actually interact with a Tonberry. Now, in Final Fantasy XII, we're going to move on because Final Fantasy XI, we're done with them. They had their time. Final Fantasy XII, it was another very underwhelming appearance for the Tonberry. Final Fantasy XII seems to have this pattern with a lot of classic Final Fantasy enemies, and they were simply a code name given to a pilot of an air-to-ground offensive in the intro of the game. They don't actually ever appear as, Tonberries in Final Fantasy XII, until the sequel, Revenant Wings, came out, in which case they are an Esper and a common enemy. Now, in Final Fantasy XIII, the Tonberry makes a very limited appearance, although it's very iconic of the Tonberry's classic features. There's an initial target of a mark called Zenobia, where you have to chase down an undying Seath, And when you get there to try and kill it, a Tonberry actually comes out and kills it for you. However, as soon as he kills him, he turns on the party, and you have to deal with his very similar moves. Compared to most other Tonberries, however, he moves very quickly in this game and attacks very quickly. He has a move called Deep-Seated Grudge, which seems to be a take on everyone's Grudge. However, this one is based on the amount of damage that the Tonberry has taken. When he uses Deep-Seated Grudge, he will charge up and eventually restore all of his HP to full, while dealing the same amount of damage that he healed back onto the party. This means that he can do extreme amounts of damage, and killing him quickly is recommended. In Final Fantasy 13-2, both the Tonberry and Don Tonberry from Final Fantasy X make an appearance as rare encounters. Now, Tonberries have been confirmed for Final Fantasy XIV: A Realm Reborn. In the latest Eorzea Collection 2013 S video, we got to see a regular Tonberry as well as a King Tonberry, so hopefully we'll get to see a little bit more with them later on. I want to go over some honorable mentions just because they appear in pretty much every other Final Fantasy title after Final Fantasy V. One unique encounter I want to talk about is in Type 0, which is a game that has fallen under a lot of people's radars, where they can be gotten as a party member. This is the first time that they can be gotten as a party member without either obtaining them as a summon or using a monster taming ability. They also appear as common enemies, although they seem to be vastly different in terms of the way they dress and the weapon they use. They dress in a dark black robe and yield a massive knife compared to the ones that they usually use in the previous games. They also appear as a character named Jim in Dynami Racers, and they appear as a gunship in Kingdom Hearts 1 and 2. So hopefully you guys enjoyed getting caught up a little bit about how the Tonberry has been over the past decade or so. If you guys enjoyed this, please like, favorite, subscribe, and share. Also follow me on Facebook and Twitter in the description below. Also, feel free to donate to my YouTube channel. I would really appreciate that. It helps me get some better equipment so I can better the quality of my videos for you guys. But anyway, guys, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. Until next time, take care.